everyone. My name is Evie Lupine. Welcome back to my channel, and today I have another video for you all. Today we are going to be talking about something that has been on my mind a lot lately, and FetLife just dropped the perfect post on this for me to read that really helped solidify what it is I have been thinking on. And that would be, what do you do when your DS relationship fantasy conflicts and crashes with reality? What do you do when you have an idea in your head about your dominant, about your submissive for that matter, and that idea that you had doesn't line up with what you're actually experiencing? And I cannot take full credit for this idea. I did mention FetLife, and the reason why is because I was just scrolling through the timeline and I came across a post that was by Race Bannon, and he had done an article on or in Recon magazine for this very subject, and that would be Dom Disillusionment Syndrome. And if you don't know who Bannon is, if you've never heard of him before, he is a really famous person in the kink scene. He's an activist, an educator, a general well-known community member, and the reason why is he is really well known for his work surrounding the DSM, which is the manual that people that work in mental health use to evaluate psychiatric conditions. And he was a big advocate around the separation we now have between a clinical experience of sadism or masochism, which causes distress, and consensual kinky sadism and masochism. And so he has been really, really important for a long time, since like the 1970s. I have actually learned from him in person and taken his classes. He is a very thoughtful and well-spoken person, and so I was really excited to read this because, again, it was like exactly what I have been thinking of for the last couple of days. And so again, the subject is Dom Disillusionment Syndrome, and I'm not going to read like the whole article. I will show the relevant pieces, and if you want to find it, it will be on the Recon website. I think you can search either for the name or for Bannon himself and it should pop up. But I really want to use it as a springboard for my own thoughts, because this is something that I have seen for a long time, but I've never really heard anyone else put a name to. So tell me if this sounds familiar. Maybe you are someone or you know someone that has been in the kink scene for a long time. Maybe they are submissive or a slave, somewhere on the S-type spectrum, and they are really devoted to wanting to have a DS relationship. They're really active. They go to mixers, high protocol nights, any kind of kink event. They're very, very involved. They educate themselves a lot. They're pretty knowledgeable. But when they get into relationships and they think they found the perfect dom, the perfect master, it goes really well for a couple of weeks, maybe even a few months, and they are sure they have finally found the perfect dom amongst all of the other fake doms or liars or actors. They know they have a genuine DS relationship. And then suddenly, out of the blue, you get a text or something on FetLife or a phone call, and this person's like, that person wasn't a real dom, they were actually fake the whole time. I just can't seem to find a real DS relationship. Where are the real doms? I keep getting tricked, basically. Something along those lines, where somebody is trying really, really hard to have a genuine DS relationship that meets their needs, and even when they find someone that seems to fit, it doesn't tend to last for very long. Now, before I get to my point, I do want to say and acknowledge that it can be very difficult to find compatible partners. It can be very difficult to find people that want DS the same way you do. Even when you have all of the same kinks, you can both want high protocol, servitude, service submission, pet play, everything all put together. And then at the end of the day, you're looking for 24/7 TPE, and they are looking for basically the bedroom with a little bit extra. And that conflict is real. It can be very hard to find people that want the same things that you do, and there are definitely people that are willing to lie and conceal their own needs because they value having a relationship and maybe having sex or having some kind of DS at all versus the kind that actually matches their real style. However, I would like to propose an alternative potential explanation for this pattern. And I'm not saying this to blame anyone, I just want to maybe explore this thought. So while it could be that someone is really genuinely not finding people that they are compatible with long term and they are getting deceived in some way, maybe it's how they are thinking about their DOMs. Maybe it is only something where they can engage as a submissive so long as their dominant perfectly matches the fantasy they have built up in their heads. Maybe they have cried out, "There are no real DOMs. No one has ever really earned my submission." And the reason they think that is because their expectations over what it means to be a real DOM or a real sub are actually fairly unrealistic. And that brings us back to the Dom Disillusionment Syndrome, when the submissive is made aware of that gap between the fantasy they have in their head and the dominant as an actual person and how they act in reality. And when a submissive gets into that headspace where they believe the dominant is not really dominant anymore, that is very corrosive to the relationship and can very much be fatal to that DS if not addressed quickly. As Bannon states, I think this sort of fantasy versus reality clash happens a lot more in the kink and fetish scene than most of us want to admit. Submissives frequently elevate their dominance to a near deified status because it fits with the classic fantasy scenario of the all-knowing, all-wise, and all-skilled dominant. This is a recipe for disaster. The disconnect between fantasy and reality must be pointed out and addressed early in any relationship founded upon power dynamics. Perhaps this will rankle some of the purists, but the fact is our entire scene is based on fantasy. While the physical things we do with each other, from the gear we wear to the various erotic practices we explore, are a physical reality, the reasons why we do those things are spawned from our individual and collective fantasies and the mindsets they create. If, as a submissive, you are looking to be swept off your feet by the perfect dominant who knows all, senses all, and never errs, be depressed, feel the need to learn, or otherwise simply be an imperfect human being, you're in for a buttload of disappointment. And adding on to that, I would say that one of the common appeals for getting into DS of any kind is to find someone that has high expectations, both of themselves and of you. They have very high standards for their own behavior. You want to find someone that is like a cut above the rest, really has their life together, can provide for you, and in that way be able to provide an escape from your everyday life and your everyday experiences because they totally have everything else figured out. And there's an idea that having this kind of relationship with a person that is so put together and has such expectations is you get to like escape from the everyday squabbles of vanilla relationships. There is no more arguing over who takes out the trash. They're never going to forget anything important to you. They're not going to forget your birthday. Like all of that's going to be solved because you have found this very high quality being in the form of a dominant. And I will never shame anyone for their fantasies. I think it is totally reasonable. Like, why in a fantasy, in your ideal relationship, would you want to have petty squabbles? Why would you want to have fights with someone that you are meant to be very compatible with? Like, I understand why we don't include that in our brain, in our ideals. However, I think the problem is when you can't separate what is realistic about that fantasy from what is not. Like, I think most people that have a fantasy world understand that, like, in reality, you can't really be a princess that's being captured and taken hostage by, like, a big terrifying dragon. But then when you transplant maybe these other ideas that seem so much more normal and realistic, people struggle a lot with what in that can I actually take into my expectations for a DS relationship. And I find it kind of ironic how often this happens, considering how much people just put 50 Shades of Grey on blast. Like, how many conversations have we had on this channel about 50 Shades of Grey being a bad representation and being unrealistic, and how it talks about kink and showing a dom that has this or that, or is a billionaire that owns 3 helicopters and always knows exactly what Anna wants. Like, people pick apart what is wrong in 50 Shades with a very fine-tooth comb and are very quick to point out how it's toxic, how it is unrealistic, and of course that's not even getting into the parts of 50 Shades of Grey that maybe show abuse or show a bad kink example in general. But when it comes to it being unrealistic, people really zoom in on that. But don't we seem to have our own issues when it comes to separating fantasy from reality, just as people that maybe read 50 Shades of Grey do? Like, you might not even realize that some of the expectations you have are unrealistic, thinking that a dom is never going to need to admit failure or learn anything else. They're never going to have a bad mental health day. They are never going to mess up during a scene. They are never going to call you by the wrong name. Like, a million other things that we maybe can assume, especially as submissives, wouldn't happen if someone is a real dom. And being a dom doesn't mean they're incapable of disappointing you. I think some people look to DS as a solution for finding a perfect relationship because they think if they can control enough factors, they will find someone that can never hurt them, never disappoint them, never drop the ball. And if those things do happen, if someone lets you down, disappoints you, forgets something important to you, that doesn't mean they're not a dom. It means they're human and they've made a mistake. And to me, one of the factors that makes someone not a real dom is not do these actions happen in the relationship, but how do they handle them? How do they handle criticism? Do they lash out and get angry and shut down? Do they punish you for speaking out and telling them when something goes wrong or when you had a problem with something? I think being a good leader is being able to take criticism on board, admit fault, being able to hear when you have made a mistake and make a plan for it not happening in the future, and offering a genuine, honest apology. That is, to me, just some of the factors that make someone a real dom, because being a real dom and being a good leader are two very similar things. So it's not always about, do they sometimes forget about a rule you have? Do they sometimes forget about a thing they promised you? It's about how do they act and reflect when those things happen in the first place. And I think some of this can go back to the confusion some people have around being domineering being the same as being dominant. Being domineering, being bossy, being forceful, being brash, being someone that has a my way or the highway attitude. For some people that feels very dominant, but I would argue that for most people that's more like being an asshole than actually being a dom. And instead, someone that is transparent, that is forthcoming, that knows their limitations, that communicates when they have failed or let you down. To me, being secure enough, being confident enough to be able to say, hey, I fucked up, that is actually pretty fucking domly, if I do say so myself. And if all it takes to lose your sense of submission to that person is seeing them fumble with a knot or forget to pick up the groceries, I would even say maybe you weren't really submissive to that person, but you were submissive to the idea you had of them in your head. And being honest, which one would you rather have? Would you rather have someone that is domineering and controlling and abrasive and can never ever admit fault? Or do you want someone that, again, is understanding and transparent and communicates with you and is upfront about their shortcomings? Which one do you think is better for a sustainable long-term relationship, even if one of them allows you to have maybe a little bit of a more realistic daily fantasy experience? I know which one I'd pick, and for you, I would maybe consider your answer either the next time you are getting into a relationship or the next time you have an issue with this disillusionment. And to be honest, I think this is something we have a real double standard around. Let's say, for example, we have Master Big Dick Jimmy walk into a conversation and he comes in like, all submissives have to do X, or you're not a real submissive if you don't do this, or if you don't have long hair or whatever. And for the most part, if that is a real conversation happening in meat space, most people are going to hear that and either laugh them out of the room or just ignore what they're saying, because most people realize that trying to put all subs into a single box just doesn't work, and it says more about their lack of experience or their own porn habits and the fact they learned about BDSM just from porn, more so about it actually being a realistic reflection of what submissives should be like. But I don't think we always extend that conversation to the other side. I think people are much more likely to say, all DOMs have to do this. And if they don't do this, then they are toxic and bad or abusive. Or if they're doing this, they're doing it to manipulate you. And I've made videos talking about spotting fake DOMs or looking for red flags. And if you're not careful, it's really, really easy to lump in unrealistic behavioral expectations with actual red flags. And this is not to imply that this doesn't happen in the opposite direction. I have been talking about DOM disillusionment, but it can absolutely be the case that a DOM could be disillusioned with their submissive. And in that case, I think it's not as much of a focus, because if you are doubting your submissive's submissive nature or how devoted they are to the relationship, you have a lot of tools that you can use in your dynamic to help mitigate that, right? You can do punishment. You can have them write an essay about how much they love being submissive. You can do scenes together. You can do a lot to sort of shore up that end of the relationship, such that I don't think a DOM being disillusioned with their submissive is as fatal, I think. And even if the submissive has moments of failure, even when they let a DOM down, that is kind of understood to be part of the experience, and it's part of doing power exchange to have those moments of building up and improvement and addressing shortcomings and using DS as a tool to make that better and less frequent. And that grace just simply does not exist in the opposite direction. And part of that is because as a submissive, you can't give your DOM assignments to improve a skill. You can't punish them. You can't give them a talking to. There's a lot of things that kind of work in one direction that don't work in the other. And when you don't have easier solutions within your dynamic, it makes it harder to address unless you call it out very plainly. And when you have things like training and punishments and verbal talking tos at your disposal, I think it can be an easy problem to ignore. But on the other side of that same coin, I think this also sort of speaks to the fact that sometimes I don't think we consider how much of a role submissives themselves play in a relationship. I think some people are likely to go basically oh, I'm just submissive. How much damage could they do anyways because they're just submissive? And we place a lot of power in the relationship on the DOMs because they're the ones that receive the power. But it is ultimately a partnership, and both people contribute to maintaining that fantasy and maintaining that power exchange. So there's almost this perverse extra layer to all of this where we disempower submissives because we don't think they're important enough to actually do harm in the relationship. And that allows us to ignore the fact that submissives can, in fact, and do hurt their partners. And if you are a Dom that is listening to this and you have been really struggling with feeling like you have to be a mind reader, you have to be perfect all the time, or your submissive won't want to submit to you anymore, like, trust me, we hear you, we see you. That is a perfectly valid thing to be experiencing, and hopefully videos like this one help reduce how often that happens. But I do want to also go back and touch on something that came up earlier in the article, which is the idea that our scene, our relationships, are built on fantasies, both personal and collective. And this one is definitely a spicy take. Not everyone agrees with this. I've actually made a video years and years ago where I talked about, is kink just fantasy? And it's no longer up because it was definitely pretty controversial, but I think this kind of gets into that same idea that I was trying to say, but maybe a little bit more eloquently. And I want to empower people to have whatever relationship feels the most true to them. Be that a bedroom only, we know everything is just role play kind of relationship, or this is like a true part of my soul that cannot be removed, and doing DS is a true experience of my identity. Whatever it is between that, either one, it's all valid, and I never want to say you can't have your own perspective on how you feel about your DS. But regardless of how you are approaching it, I think everyone should keep in mind what Bannon says next, which is, while it's in the nature of erotic fantasy to wallow in the idealized representations of dominance and submission, not realizing those representations are indeed idealized and not grounded in reality is a prerequisite for an unhealthy and unhappy relationship, and at times can even be dangerous. So the next time you're trying to figure out, why aren't my DS relationships working? Why can't I find people that I'm compatible with? I think it's worth reflecting on, what are your expectations in that relationship? Is it maybe that you are thinking something impossible is going to happen and you have maybe been approaching this from the wrong direction? And I do want to say really quickly here, I want to be careful in that I'm not trying to say this should be an excuse for being a lazy Dom or being a shit person or even abusive behavior. This is not about being able to excuse Doms that have abusive behavior patterns. It is about being able to recognize that Doms are real people and not cardboard cutouts to project your fantasies on. So maybe you have been listening to this and you realize that maybe you have been falling into some of the mindset patterns that we've been discussing, and you want to escape that trap. You want to not set yourself up for disappointment. How can you do that? Well, I think the best way to avoid disappointment in all things really is to have clear expectations up front. And I think the mistake that people make, even in DS, is that they look at the play part too much. They look at the contract. They look at the rules. They look at punishments. They don't always talk about what both people as personalities, as people with lived histories, bring to that experience of DS. I think you should also talk about things like, I have really shit time management skills. I am someone that can be really hard to get a hold of at work. I have a kid I have to take care of on the weekends, and I'm not going to be available. I deal with stress by playing hours of video games. Like, whatever it is, make sure that is on the table ahead of time for both sides. I think this is a great time for some good old-fashioned mutual vulnerability, which is how you build deep bonding in your relationships. And I think that can be really helpful, so that way when it does eventually happen in the relationship, when these things come up, they're not a surprise. And honestly, like, make it a mantra, make it your mindset going into DS that people are not perfect, even your Doms. And while it can be fun to roleplay worshiping a perfect God, I think there is a level of even more sincere devotion that can be built when you are committed to maintaining your submission to someone even through their imperfections. And when you do have those moments of struggle, just remember that it is about the mindset you go into things with. Yes, it can destroy your relationship if you let it. If you instead act like, okay, well, this is a way that we can deepen our bond. This is a way that I can even show a deeper layer of my submission, of my service. It can actually reinforce your dynamic if you go into it with the right frame of mind. And personally for me, I think when you have those moments of struggle and rawness and realness, like remember, you are seeing someone in a very intimate, vulnerable space that they maybe don't let a lot of other people see. And that can be a very profound thing, again, if you let it. So just remember, these can be opportunities and not always things to be avoided. And I think that's the natural evolution of a DS relationship. I think at the beginning, you have this period of mutual fantasy, and then 10 years later, you have a very real, honest, deep experience. And I think where people can get lost is when the relationship is undergoing that metamorphosis from a mutual fantasy into a very raw and real experience. And I know I would prefer having that rawness, having that realness of knowing each other on a deep and intimate level, flaws and all. I know I would definitely want that. And I think that is everything that I have to share today on this subject. If you did enjoy it, please let me know down in the comment section below. I would love to hear your thoughts, stories, ideas, experiences, everything else. If you did want to read the full article, again, it is on Recon. It is by Race Bannon. You can find it over on that website. If you did also enjoy this and you have not already, please do subscribe because I make videos twice a week about all sorts of kink and BDSM related subjects. And finally, if you really enjoyed this, if you want to support what I do, the best way that you can do that is with Patreon. I really am so thankful for Patreon, especially with everything going on with YouTube and things just being so uncertain right now. And Patreon is like basically my little safe area from the wilderness of YouTube. So if you want to join me over there, please do. A link will be down below. If you do already support me over there, thank you so much. It means the absolute world to me. And until I see you all next time, I hope you have a great rest of your day and a great rest of your week. Bye-bye.